Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. I'm your host, Laura Blanears. Today I'm summarizing our Benchmarking Collective's recent Roundtable event in Chicago. I'll share some of the observations from the participants and their reflections on the recent benchmarking survey. The event was in Chicago, my hometown. It was a little cold for this now SoCal girl. The benchmarking roundtables, some of you as part of the collective may have been participating in virtual roundtables. The in-person roundtable last week in Chicago was fantastic. It was great energy and we present the benchmarking survey, but the conversation took its own routes in really addressing what participants want to discuss. And the top things that came up were compliance protocol, costs, and dependent support. So with that, I'll dive right in. The compliance conversation was really around preparedness. I think folks that we talked to and participated in this discussion are largely one woman, one man shows managing a program between 100 US foreign nationals to 300. And that may include a global program. And what I think the struggle everyone did express or nodded to was that, the program management in addition to the day-to-day work is really difficult to balance. So a lot of folks are relying on their vendors to make sure the communications are timely and that they're receiving compliance best practices. So folks are checking in with one another about, how are they preparing? What have they done? And the top compliance piece is I-9 audit. So we've discussed in previous episodes here what kind of compliance preparedness we should be prioritizing in Q1 and frankly, all through 2025. And it really does lead with the I-9. And the best way to do that is through an I-9 audit. I've had questions from prospective clients, friends in the industry about, what's a report that I can show my leaders, stakeholders about compliance. And really, it's an audit report. And engaging in an audit really requires a lot of time and potentially resources to support the audit, whether that's partnership with vendor or other, legal teams within your organization, and a readout of that report. Prioritizing the I-9, I think, makes a ton of sense, and that's what the conversation really revolved around at our benchmarking conversation, and it's a lot of, how deep the audit's gonna be, and I think folks were discussing, how much capacity or how much resources they had around it. The other 2 audits that, again, we've talked about in previous episodes, but that folks mentioned were the public access file audit and PERM audit files. I think, of course, the I-9 is gonna be the most important because that's where we are likely to see a lot of government inspections, and the I-9 government inspections are not necessarily complaint driven, where the other 2, public access file and PERM audit file, would likely be a complaint driven process for an audit. I bring that up because, when I talk about likelihood of audits, of course, you want to make sure your program is in compliance. But when you think about likelihood of audit or likelihood of pressure testing your compliance, the public access file and the PERM audit files, those are from a complaint driven process. So, in a likelihood scenario, that's a lower likelihood for folks that are trying to understand their company's risk tolerance. The other piece that came into play was the compliance of foreign national employees about their travel documents, checking in with US consulates, how are companies communicating about compliance for the foreign nationals. So again, as a program lead, a global mobility manager, you're managing a lot of compliance components. The first being what's the company as a sponsor of foreign national moving people around the world? What are the company's compliance responsibilities? And then supporting, although ultimately not completely responsible for the foreign nationals compliance. And so Cassie Ramos's episode, if you haven't caught it already, is an excellent summary in discussing how to effectively communicate to a foreign national population. But that was a large part of the conversation at our benchmarking roundtable in Chicago. And a lot of it was how companies believe they're effectively addressing the travel guidance US consular guidance to their foreign national employees. And our survey does cover some of the ways companies are effectively or perceiving they're effectively reaching their foreign national population or their global mobility program. And folks really highlighted the impact of town halls. So they talked about how in Q4 of 2024, in the wake of the presidential election here in the US, how to discuss what would the program look like, what would sponsorship look like, what would compliance look like in 2025. A lot of folks held those conversations in 2024 and then continue to sort of have town halls in the past couple of months to address overall sort of travel best practices. And a lot of folks are framing it in travel best practices and then also communicating in these town halls what the expectation is the company for when an employee travels abroad, whether that's for personal or business, because they're explaining their remote work internationally policies. They're discussing if a laptop can travel outside the US. One thing we're hearing this week, this is after the roundtable, we're hearing from clients who are returning into the US inspections of laptops, phones as they're re entering the US. So I think in the town halls, making sure that the employees have an understanding of what paperwork they need to show compliance, to show that they are in a lawful authorized work status in the US, to carry around those documents, but also understanding what kind of remote policies companies have. And companies feel like the town hall is the best way to address. And then you get a sense of, who's asking a lot of the follow-up questions to then set up the one-on-one calls to address what might be a very specific need for certain individual employees. One interesting point that came out of the roundtable is there are a couple companies that are very liberal with their remote work policies. So, companies in light of COVID offered remote work benefits. And then, in addition, to stay competitive or rather to beat the competition, some of these companies are offering like international remote workspaces and allowing employees to not only work remote in the US, but have certain extended periods where they can be internationally remote. This company has some restrictions based on its industry about where their data can flow. So they have a really, quite frankly, complicated matrix of what's allowed and how long it's allowed, but is effectively communicating those permissions and flexibilities to all of its employees to take advantage of as a way to recruit and retain talent in light of, fierce competition for the best and the brightest. So that was really interesting. I think it was a tremendous lift when I, was hearing how the policy was developed and the matrix of where these employees can work, how they can bring the work, how long they can work. I think it's a tremendous amount of hours and resources dedicated to making this all work for the company, but it was pretty exciting and, interesting to hear how some companies are approaching. There were some other companies that are a little bit more restrictive based on their industry about how they can work remote and that it was largely, an exception if someone could work remote internationally, given the industry and their sort of general policies. So I think that's all to say, I believe that remote work and remote work internationally is going to be tested in the next couple of years. But what we're hearing is that most companies have sort of an exception policy that can accommodate if an employee gets stuck abroad because of change in consular processing or administrative processing, which I think we're going to see more and more of. So I think program leads are just really attuned to this and knowing that that's going to happen. So have the policies. I think this is one of those, not to pile on extra work, but the folks that are developing really robust remote work international policies have worked with like IT, have worked with other leaders within the company to ensure that everybody's aware and they have the right, data security, IT security pieces in play. Because when a laptop goes abroad, they want to make sure that that's compliant with the overall, business objectives of the company. Wow. So there was a robust discussion on remote work and those policies. The other piece that came up was sort of cost sharing and dependent fees. I would say overwhelmingly the majority of companies are supporting dependent fees, and that comes up in the survey. So everybody in the room confirmed when they're relocating a talent from an entity abroad into the US, they're often uprooting a family for that relocation. And so there was a high commitment to dependent support, especially in those situations, which makes a ton of sense. I don't think our survey covered, that kind of in-depth dependent support, but overall, the majority of companies are supporting dependents in their extension of stay, and most are supporting the work permit for the dependent of the employee that they're sponsoring. There were some really interesting and creative ways of cost sharing. So I think this is a common one to come up in these benchmarking roundtables, virtually or in person. And I think it's because a lot of companies really want to know what other companies in their industry or not in their industry are doing, like kind of a look under the hood, because ultimately I think their recruiters or the global mobility space is always interested from a competitiveness of what is my company covering? Are you covering that? Is that competitive within the industries as a competitive recruiting tool? So that came up and was a large part of the discussion. So that went a little off script from what was covered in the survey, but that, most companies are still pretty cost conscious. And I think that reflects the economic environment that we're in. Again, I'm not an economist, I'm an immigration attorney, but it does seem to sort of ebb and flow with the economy of what benefits the company is excited and happy to pay and when they're restricting. And we're still kind of in the restrictive space. And there were some really interesting cost sharing conversations that certain companies were really leading in the sense of how they're handling conversations where they've cut all premium processing except for transfers. But they're communicating the importance of premium processing to their employees. And they're sharing this in a light of transparency that from an economic standpoint, the company can't support premium processing for everybody. That being said, we encourage you to pay this out of pocket. And they're having a really warm reception to that conversation. I think because they're framing it as we're here to support you. We want to be transparent, but we also have to sort of be realistic with what the company can or can't share. So I thought that was really interesting because my initial reaction was like, oh, wow, you're suggesting premium processing, but then not offering it from the company. Like that must be tough. But it sounds like that's going very well from how they're framing it and how they're having the conversation with their employee population. In addition, this company has been very transparent with recent layoffs and things like that so that all the employees are kind of aware of the economic stance of the company and needing to be conservative and cut costs. So that was really interesting. The conversation were so great. We also covered on PERM, and this kind of goes into compliance. Some companies that have had recent restructuring that are now eligible for PERM recruitment, PERM submission are feeling really nervous about supporting, sort of a backed up perm program for submission because of one, the environment of, the current governmental landscape with the emphasis on protecting US workers in light of a layoff, sponsoring or the perception of supporting foreign national workers in this economy with layoff of US workers could be perceived negatively. So the companies that are in this situation are nervous and treading really lightly. They, of course, are complying with perm rules, but are nervous about, frankly, the recruitment piece, given the likelihood of unsuccessful recruitment of perm. So if you're in that situation, make sure you're having a lot of conversations with counsel, making sure you're carefully planning and having conversations with the impacted foreign nationals. If those foreign nationals have been in a perm backlog, it could be a situation where these employees may be maxing out of their status. So it could be thinking through some alternative plans. I was just on a call yesterday with a client who was in that situation. Perm had failed under previous counsel. And, likely the economic environment that they're in, looking at the job, it does seem likely that a fully remote position would get a lot of qualified applicants. So they're looking at it a little differently, both because we're now in a max out situation and they can accommodate an international rotation. So they're looking into whether, the foreign national employee is interested in that. And that could be a huge benefit that they're open to, potentially sponsoring for a manager role and coming back in an EB1 multinational manager and avoiding the labor market test entirely. for the next 2 years, not to mention a much better preference category for the employee. So there are some ways to navigate it, but it is very individualized. Your program may or may not be able to accommodate these types of things. That's all to say, the conversation was great, a lot of really great ideas, and, I walk away just listening and with these really interesting stories and sort of the qualitative stories that back up some of the surveys that we are putting out there. So if you haven't already, do check out the Benchmarking Collective to take a look at the recently released Q1 survey and get involved with one of these virtual roundtables, or perhaps Sydney will come to a city near you and you can join us for a lunch conversation together. We'll catch you there. Until next time.